Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Intisar Fakir. I am the director of the North Africa and Sahel program at the Middle East Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, a discussion with Ian Martin, the former special representative of the Secretary General and head of the United Nations support mission in Libya. Among his previous assignments, Ian has led the UN human rights and peace operations in countries including Rwanda, Timor-Leste. Ian is also a former Amnesty International Secretary General, and his publications on UN intervention include Self-Determination in East Timor. Today, we are going to talk about your latest book, Ian, All Necessary Measures, the United Nations and the International Intervention in Libya, which came out earlier this year. In it, you chronicle the international engagement in Libya from the rise of the protests in February 2011 to the first election in July 2012. And with that, your experience as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's post-conflict planning advisor, and then as the head of the UN support mission for Libya. It's a pleasure to have you with us here at MEI. Also in conversation with us today is Ben Fishman. He is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute and former director for Libya at the National Security Council. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a quick note with our audience. First, we will hear from Ian, and then we'll hear from Ben, and then we will take audience questions. So please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A feature. If you have any, and if you are watching us right now on the live stream, please submit your questions to events@mei.edu. Again, that's events@mei.edu. Again, back to you, Ian and Ben. Welcome to you both. Ian, in your book, among the reasons that you mention have motivated you to write this account is a desire to ensure a fuller and more accurate understanding of the period of NATO involvement and the dynamics among the actors involved. My question, just to get you started, is why now? Why 10 years later?
Well, first, thank you very much for the opportunity, and good day to everybody online. As you say, I wanted to revisit 2011, 2012, because I had an increasing irritation with what I think are at best superficial and very often rather distorted references to it. It's not uncommon these days to see Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya mentioned in the same breath. I think I even saw a reference to the US invasion of Libya the other day. And I think the actual circumstances of the intervention in Libya are not today well understood. So that was one motive. The other motive, I think, was that having played a role in that first year and having left Libya after the first election in July 2012, which was still a moment of relative optimism. And sadly, Ambassador Chris Stevens was killed just before I left Libya. But even then, there was a hope that a rather successful election of a General National Congress could be the basis for a more legitimate government going forward that could tackle the major issues that were still there. So I felt I ought to ask myself whether there was more we could have done in that early period that would perhaps have made Libya's later very sad trajectory to where it is today somewhat less unhappy. So those are really my two motives, apart from having something to do during the COVID lockdown in London. Can I perhaps go on to sort of set out the main issues that I then try to tackle in the book, because they're five. I mean, the first is the original case for intervention. Was there genuinely a fear of a massacre in Benghazi? How well founded was that fear? Was there a proper case for a humanitarian intervention? I look at the way decisions were made in the key capitals and the way that the Security Council debated its authorization of military action. One element of that I think is not what's always featured today is how, when it's looked at as a kind of Western intervention, is how strong were the calls from the Arab world, in fact, and not only from some Arab governments led by Qatar, from Libyans, of course, and indeed from a lot of civil society. And today, sometimes that discussion is sort of decontextualized from the wider context of the uprisings in the Arab world at that time. It's interesting, I think, to look at the reluctance with which President Obama finally decided to go with intervention against very strong reservations, particularly led by Defense Secretary Gates, supported, by the way, by Vice President Biden. Then Gates quotes President Obama as saying to him that it was a 51-49 decision. So it's not a gung-ho intervention. It was much more gung-ho when we look at Sarkozy and Cameron in Europe, but not in terms of the US decision. And then the dynamics in the UN Security Council are interesting. How was it that they got the support of the Africans, particularly South Africa, which would become a very strong critic, in fact, of the intervention? Why did Russia abstain, not veto? There's interesting differences of view, apparently, between President Medvedev and then Prime Minister Putin. So that's the first thing. How did the intervention actually come about in the first place? Second issue I look at is the way that once there was a mandate from the Security Council for military action, how that unfolded, how NATO played its role. Did it exceed a mandate that was to protect civilians by becoming the air force of the rebels and seeking regime change? It's quite hard to define exactly where the line was crossed, but I do believe that line was crossed, and it did become an operation that certainly would never have achieved a Security Council mandate if the Council had known where it was going to go. And then another aspect of the military action that isn't very much written about are the Special Forces operations. Prime Minister David Cameron writes in his memoir that with our allies, France, Qatar, and the UAE, we ended up steering the ramshackle Libyan army from a secret cell in Paris, providing weapons, support, and intelligence to the rebels planning an assault on Tripoli. This quartet of countries, known internally as the Four Amigos, focused on training, equipping, and mentoring effective militias in the West. Though this was known to NATO and the US, once again, we were operating outside the traditional structures. And I may say outside any authorization by the Security Council or under international law. And in that Special Forces operation, one can begin to see how it contributed to fragmented armed groups with arms supplies from Qatar and the UAE going to different armed groups of somewhat different ideological tendencies. Third issue I look at is whether there was ever a possibility of a mediated outcome, of a managed transition once the conflict had begun. There were United Nations efforts to that end, led by Mr. Al-Khatib, the former foreign minister of Jordan, who was the UN special envoy. The African Union was involved. In fact, they were the only ones who dealt directly with Gaddafi. Norway had a little known effort, and others, Turkey and so on, were involved. But it was not a coordinated effort. And my conclusion there is that the best chances of a mediated outcome would have been if, on the one hand, the African Union had exercised its influence on Gaddafi, and on the other hand, the leading interveners, France, the UK, had encouraged the National Transitional Council to a negotiation, whereas actually, on the contrary, they didn't themselves genuinely support mediation, even by the UN. Of course, we can't utterly answer the question, and perhaps the biggest obstacle was Gaddafi's own obduracy and his rhetoric, which never changed. Fourth issue I look at is the post-conflict planning. As you mentioned, that was a responsibility I had for the UN. President Obama famously said that while the intervention was justified, not planning for the day after was the biggest mistake of his presidency. In fact, there were efforts, certainly inside the US government. Ben knows more about this than I do. The post-Q, the Gaddafi task force, they called it. The United Nations efforts I was responsible for, the UK, and we worked with Libyans of the National Transitional Council. But I look at what the weaknesses were in that thinking, which I think in retrospect was really over-focused on what people talked about as the first 100 days. It was the kind of Iraq effect, the fear that the fall of Tripoli could be like the chaos of the fall of Baghdad. Great relief when that didn't happen, but not adequate thinking about the longer term. And one of the big issues there is, should there have been a big military operation, international military operation, a peacekeeping operation, a stabilization operation? I don't think so. It certainly wasn't feasible. The Libyans were strongly against it. Nobody was willing to do it. I don't think personally it would have left Libya in a better place today. And then the fifth and final thing I look at is how things played out on the ground in the first year, where one major controversy is whether the first elections were held too soon. My own view is that was a Libyan decision, and it was certainly not pressed on them by the international community, and I think was inevitable because of the very limited authority of the National Transitional Council and the first government it stood up. But then the biggest failure on the ground was to begin to tackle the issue of the armed groups. And those two issues really bring us back to today, where again, should elections happen, how can they be achieved? What is to be done 10 years, 11 years later with the proliferation of armed groups are still issues that Libya is grappling with.
Thank you for that, Ian. Ben, as you listen to Ian, how do his assessments and his conclusions sort of square with your own experience, having been on the inside from the US side?
Well, first, thanks, Intisar, for inviting me to speak in this panel. And Ian makes a very welcome contribution to the history of this event, the intervention and the immediate aftermath, and obviously what he implied. We've been dealing with this more or less the same issues over the last decade plus. And I have an article coming out about Groundhog Day in Libya, because we've seen these series of civil wars and peace efforts, and then civil war again and peace efforts. And now we're again on the brink of a civil war if elections can't happen, to sort of throw off the pattern. Since we're in the UN General Assembly week, I just noticed that note for there's no planned major Libya event that we had in 2012, nor is there even a side event planned. So this speaks to the lack of attention, not only from the United States, which we heard about before, but the international community. There are events in Europe planned and ongoing meetings in Europe and others on the side who continue to interfere, and we can talk about the external actors in the Q&A. But one major impetus, or one major factor that we were driving towards in 2012, or actually 2011, Ian depicts the sequences of international contact groups in the intervention and the period politically to match the military efforts on the ground. In the UNGA week, there was a head of state event with the head of what was called the National Transition Council, but he was flanked by Obama, Macron, Cameron, a number of Arab leaders. That just symbolizes the importance of what was the Libyan issue for at the time. That is not the case this year, and obviously there are other issues that the international community is facing, but this is also symbolized by Ian was obviously the first director of UNSMIL, the special representative of the Secretary General. We've gone 7, 8, 9 months without that position filled. We just had a new one announced, but 7, by my count, 6 or 7, because you have to depend on how you count and multiple actors. 7 SRSGs during that time period. And we talk about expertise and embassies and things like that and turnover. But if you have 7 XRSGs in 10 or 11 years, it just speaks to the divided situation in the international community. And you have to relearn the issues. And actually, I forgot the last one, so 7 or 8. And it's a problem. And obviously you want me to focus on the US, and I can do that as well. One issue that dovetails, or 2 that dovetail with Ian's presentation in his book is I want to talk about more specifically on the security elements that he mentioned, not just the whether it's a peacekeeping force or not a peacekeeping force, but the role of UN and international community on security issues in 2011, 2012. Basically the footprint of not only the UN but also the international embassies. And finally, the Libyan role, which Ian also alludes to in the book, and what he just said a moment ago. We did have plans. I'm still puzzled by President Obama's statement about not planning for the day after. I can elaborate on those plans, but notable quote that I found doing research for this other paper and looking back from my correspondence is Joel Feltman, who was the Assistant Secretary of the department at the time, the State Department, and became a senior UN official later on, notably reported back to Washington in August of 2011 during the intervention, a trip that I was on as well. He said, the US has task force, Benghazi doesn't. And that sort of reflects the clash of both the issue of Libyans' preparations, or the role of the NTC at the time, the body that was supposedly representing the Libyans. Ian gets more in the depths of that in the book, and this question about the 2012 elections that I saw in the Q&A as well. That was their mission, to basically get rid of Gaddafi and hand it over, because to some, they didn't have a legitimacy going forward. And they were often anonymous actors, obviously Jalil and Jibril and people like that, but they didn't have legitimacy in the middle of 2012. The issue of security is not just a peacekeeping force or not a peacekeeping force, but obviously like what we were going to do about these armed groups, whether there was a DDR program. Ian rightly admits, I think, in his book, that the defense advisor that he managed, an excellent officer from Australia, but he didn't arrive until the middle of 2012, and whether that could have been stood up an effort could have been stood up earlier. And we were totally averse, the United States, from entering that field until after the Benghazi efforts. And there's a long story there, but the issues of what we were planning on doing and unable to do basically collapse. And that relates to this footprint issue of what we were able to do, offer in the United States after the intervention. Ian and I were just having a sort of a conversation about the anti-intervention folks and the narrative about and comparisons to Iraq and Afghanistan. This idea that by Phil Gordon and others that any intervention in the Middle East is hopeless because we occupied Iraq and that failed. We didn't do anything on Syria. That's a disaster. And we didn't occupy Libya, but we intervened and that was a disaster. There's other obvious options in between. Our footprint and the embassy, and Ian describes the footprint of the UN mission that he was responsible for, was pretty minimal, and rightly so, as he argued. But our footprint in the embassy was like 3 or 4 actual officers to do everything. And what could we have done? I've argued many times that the thing that we could have done was deployed several post-conflict specialists with experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan or other places to help the Libyans, to help the international community coordinate what was a crucial time between beginning of January 2012 or even earlier, and the tragic events in Benghazi that we can go into how they permanently affected the U.S. approach to Libya. I think that would have been a crucial difference. Obviously, these are all counterfactual arguments. We can't prove anything, but had we approached things a little bit differently, I think the outcomes would have been different, because we did have significant opportunities in this critical period that Ian examines. I'll close with the Libyan role, and this, I'm going to quote back Ian to himself, quoting Ian's book. It's a meta comparison. Ian's book that cites his presentation to the UN. And this is even before the he deployed on the ground. This is his presentation to the UN Security Council. It is inappropriate to attempt to draw up an international plan which does not have Libyan ownership, or for international actors to make premature assessments as to where Libya will choose to look for whatever assistance it decides to require. It decides it requires. This goes to the issue of Libyan ownership, and this is a sensitive issue. How can you push the Libyans to do something that they don't want, or they don't receive? And the message that we got back even before 2012 was, thank you for the intervention. You've saved us. You've saved our lives. You've gotten rid of this brutal dictator we've had to live with for 42 years, but we can handle things for now. That perhaps needed a stronger reaction. Not just from Ian, because he was representing the international community, the UN, but from a couple of people who are actors who participated in the intervention himself and said, we went out of our way to help you. Perhaps you need some of this assistance and specifically in X areas. And we were planning on doing this assessments, not just assessments, but various visits to specialized areas, border security, the economic issues, to help with their various ministries. But that was all in the fall of 2012. And obviously the events intervened. The tragedy of Benghazi, that I should have said was exactly 10 years ago on September 11th. And unfortunately, we weren't able to do those kind of things. And it took a long time for us to reconstitute our assistance to Libyans. But again, our embassy was forced out of Tripoli and in 2014 during the first civil war, and it hasn't returned since. From a practical standpoint, in addition to a logistics and security standpoint, that has made an enormous difference on our ability to interact with the Libyans. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions about our future role with Libya, but thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for an excellent contribution, Ian.
Thank you, Ben. I have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, but I wanted to maybe pick up a little bit on something that you both have mentioned, Ben, with your remarks on Libyan ownership and agency. You had mentioned that there maybe that needed a stronger reaction. I'm very curious, how would you have seen that play out? And then maybe taking a step back a little bit, Ian, for you, the role of external actors, this is something that comes through very clearly in the book and in recounting the experience. It's a crucial element from the start. But would you have foreseen it shaping up the way that it shaped up in subsequent years? European divisions, Russia, UAE, Egypt and Algeria. Egypt and Saudi Arabia. How would you have foreseen it kind of playing out the way that it did?
No, certainly up until late 2012, when I left, there was no sign of the degree of external intervention that has come about since. There were, I already referred to tensions between Qatar and the UAE. One could see those playing out, but there was nothing like the external role that there is today. And when one talks about the sort of the light footprint or the responsibility on internationals to play a more proactive role, I think the key area to talk about that is in the security sector. I mean, there's no doubt that Libya needs a great deal of long-term institution building, because Gaddafi for 40 years was opposed to building most of the institutions that we associate with a modern democratic state. But the core of Libya's problem has been in the security sector. And the question is, who could and should have done more about that? And some of the interveners, the UK, for example, tends to talk as if that was a kind of UN failure. Well, actually, the UN doesn't do armies, as it were. The support to military reform, training, etc., integration is normally done by whichever bilateral actors a government chooses to involve. Ben quoted me on that. In the case of Libya, I think there was a very clear responsibility on the part of those who built up the armed groups, which essentially wasn't even the US. That was the US didn't play that role on the ground during the conflict. That was the 4 countries that had special forces on the ground that arranged arms supplies. That was France, the UK, Qatar, and the UAE. And that's where, in my view, the continuing responsibility rested, and yet wasn't significantly exerted at all. As Ben says, I would have, if I had my time again, I would have brought a UN military advisor in sooner, although I also think that there was only a limited amount that could have been done until an election took place and there was a government whose legitimacy was accepted by the armed groups, because we may come to the discussion about early elections, perhaps, but what were then referred to as revolutionary battalions, and some of them genuinely were those who had been part of the uprising. They were very clear that they weren't going to stand down until they had achieved their objective of seeing a government that they had elected in place in Libya. And they weren't really ready to accept the authority of the very first interim government to make those decisions. The government, I think, made some bad mistakes, actually, in the numbers of people it put on the payroll and so on. But I think the central international responsibility was with the intervening countries that had built up the armed groups, but actually did next to nothing to assist Libya in standing them down and integrating them into an army under state control.
Ben, do you want to comment on that? And then I can take the questions that we have coming in through Q&A.
Well, just to piggyback on this four countries, or the four amigos, sitting in the White House, I had no idea that what they were doing, and even that they were doing it. So maybe it was on a higher level, but for the action officers, we couldn't even coordinate with that effort. And then we couldn't subsequently push those four to do what Ian was talking about. One of the things about planning and misplanning and the lack of planning, or whatever, that President Obama was regretful for, and was obviously the security field. We did have task force, like I cited Jeff Feltman and others. Perhaps we were planning for the wrong things. Humanitarian disasters didn't happen, fortunately, which is a good thing. Obviously, we were integrated with a planning cell that was a Libyan planning cell out of the country that turned out to have no influence when it came back to the country. So we had actual people deployed to that planning cell. And we had significant efforts planning or thinking about what could have been either a peace protection or some kind of protection force, not to fully on peacekeeping level, but even protecting critical infrastructure. Problem is, who could lead it? We didn't, obviously, we couldn't, and that meant that the other opportunities or other possibilities were extremely limited. And because folks didn't have a lot of experience doing that, and we were talking about what Arab countries could do that, what could be most palatable to the Libyans. The answer was nothing. And we didn't get to the point about really approaching that. The analysis was that it wouldn't be effective. We didn't get to the point about that Ian emphasizes, that who in Libya we should talk to about this, but just from a desk exercise, getting a solid contributor was hard to fathom. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ben. Just a quick reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. The chat function is disabled, so you're going to have to use the Q&A to submit your questions. And on that, we actually have a couple of questions that have come in. From the first one I will read is from Othman Gajiji, the first chairman of the NHEC and worked closely with Sir Ian. He is wondering, why do you think that the elections were early? And then another question is, we know that Libya was without institutions, so why was the focus on going to the election instead of leaving the transitional council to build state institutions? Ian?
Well, the first thing to say is that the decision on the time of elections was 100% a Libyan decision. It wasn't a decision that was influenced significantly by the international community. And it was a decision taken in August 2011, even before the fall of Tripoli, in a major debate in Benghazi. The chairman of the executive committee, sometimes called the de facto prime minister, Dr. Mahmoud Jibril, had earlier presented a roadmap to the contact group that envisaged that what would happen after the end of the conflict is that the National Transitional Council would be expanded to make it more representative of all the parts of Libya. And then it would draw up a constitution that would be submitted to a referendum, and only after that had happened would there be elections under that constitution. In the debate in Benghazi, that was rejected with an insistence that there must be elections before a constitution is drawn up, and they agreed a constitutional declaration that set the very specific timetable towards elections. The voices that called for early elections certainly included the Muslim Brotherhood, who thought as a well-organized group they might do well in the elections. In the end, they didn't do very well in the elections. But it was also, a lot of civil society voices, more liberal voices, as it were. So there was an overwhelming decision then. And that was reflected later on too. The demand for elections from Libyans, I think, because they had been denied elections for so long by Gaddafi, was overwhelming. And as Dr. Kajiji and others will well know, Libyans went ahead with elections in Misrata, in Benghazi, without any international encouragement, support. And I can't even disagree with that decision, because you can postpone elections and get on with institution building, as one of the questions implies, if you have transitional authorities whose authority is sufficiently respected. But that wasn't the case. The National Transitional Council were only tolerated as the organization that had delivered the transition. The same was with the government they appointed. Internally, they didn't feel they had the authority to act strongly. And that was true in the population as well. There was even suspicion that they might not go ahead with an election because they might want to prolong themselves, and that would have been extremely unpopular. So from my experience on the ground, I don't think there was an alternative to having an early election, with the hope that that would be the basis for a stronger government whose legitimacy, because it stood on election, would be accepted across the country. The tragedy is that the government that came out of the General National Congress elected in 2012, didn't turn out to have that authority, and that's not for me to analyze, because by then I wasn't on the ground. But there simply wasn't an option to say, let's not have elections, let's get on with institutions, particularly let's address the security sector, because there's no way the armed groups were going to accept the authority of a pre-election government.
Ben, there's a question that I think here is addressed to you, but then you can weigh in as well on the question of elections. Was the US wrong to put personnel on the ground in Benghazi, including sending Chris Stevens there on his ill-fated visit?
On the elections, I 100% agree. it wasn't for us to say yes or no. There was a technical delay, I think, for just they didn't have the equipment or ballots, or but that was I think for a handful of weeks or something like that.
3 weeks.
But we were going gung-ho for the elections, and once it was very clear to us that this was a transitional government. They didn't make any decisions. They wouldn't sign any agreements, and they viewed that as an extension of, we don't have the legitimacy of this. And specifically on the issue of money, anything that involved money, they wouldn't touch it because it was viewed as they didn't want to be accused of corruption, which is kind of ironic given the situation there is today. But anyway, and then elections, as the Libyans will remember, went off technically with barely a hitch, and it was amazing for a country that hadn't had a real election ever to implement something with this degree of enthusiasm. Now, obviously, the organization of elections, the who won, who lost, the split between parties or lists were, and individuals who were subsequently aligned to manipulate the legislation. Those are issues that can be examined separately, but the elections themselves were pretty remarkable. And that's kind of leads to the question about Benghazi, unfortunately. It's probably gave us this false sense of security, and that the situation in the country was headed on the right path. And obviously in certain areas it wasn't, and some extremists were building momentum, and whether we certainly underestimated that, and that was an intelligence failure that contributed to the attacks. It's a very hard thing for me to separate from objective analysis, whether we should or shouldn't have. Obviously, we shouldn't have, if you're looking at the end result about Benghazi. But we were in the middle of an internal State Department debate about whether to keep the facility open, and the ambassador is the ultimate judge of what to do, and he had a personal connection in Benghazi, having lived there for more than 6 months during the revolution, and he ultimately wanted to make the determination himself. And I had personally gone there probably less than a month before the attacks, and it was during Ramadan, so again, false sense of security. Everything was quiet. We still don't know the exact circumstances of the protest or not a protest, or the nature of the incursion into the grounds of the embassy. The special mission. This was all on display. Even the videos of the incursion and the spontaneity of it. On the trial for the two perpetrators that we ended up convicting, and then are in prison in the US. So I can't say we shouldn't have. If you're judging by the end result of the tragedy, obviously we shouldn't have sent Ambassador Stevens, but it was ultimately his call. We needed to make a determination, and it was better to determine that on the ground, to keep the mission open or close it, than back at Washington. And we obviously there's signs that security was worsening in Libya or in Benghazi itself. But we're not in a position from Washington to say don't go or wait a little while or something like that. We weren't close to it from Washington. We had people on the ground in Benghazi to make that assessment, and they, unfortunately, didn't call it back. And I can go on this topic for a long time, but I think even I'll close with the year-long special, what was it called? The Select Committee on Intelligence that was highly politicized, actually found no wrongdoing, for anybody except for the Defense Department was didn't have the right resources to respond adeptly.
Thanks, Ben, for that. I have a couple more questions. There's so much to pick up in this discussion, but I have a couple more questions that I wanted to ask, sort of related. Ian, I'm curious, as you are out talking to people about your book, what sort of reception are you getting? How are, in different capitals, how are people reacting to your account? And related to that, this is something that you've mentioned, Ben. It's a challenge getting people to pay attention and to sort of prioritize Libya. Can you talk a little bit, for you, Ben, can you talk a little bit more about the future role of the US? Where do you think it's going? So Ian, I'll start with you.
I haven't encountered much disagreement with the way I tell the story in the book, and I'd like to think it's sufficiently well sourced. It's a little hard to disagree with, since a lot of the accounts of how the intervention happened are really based on subsequent accounts by key decision makers. But I think what's disappointing is how little reflection there's actually been in countries for whom this was a major issue in 2011. The UK, there was an inquiry by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I don't myself think they did a very good job, and I think they were politicizing it to get back at David Cameron. I don't think that's a terribly useful retrospective analysis, although some of the evidence to it, including from the UK Chief of Defence Staff, David Richards, is important and revealing, and I quote some of it. The country that's done the most serious analysis of their own role is Norway, actually, which had set up a Libya commission. Unfortunately, they haven't translated its very good report into English, so one has to struggle with Google Translates unless you happen to read Norwegian. But that's a serious job. But to the best of my knowledge, that's the end of it in terms of serious reflection. And you can say, as would be a fair response to my book, that going back to what happened then doesn't help us very much in terms of saying how to take Libya forward out of the mess it's in today. But I still think that some of the sort of wider lessons of intervention or non-intervention ought to be learned from it. And I hope that the book might provoke a little more of that consideration, but I don't see much of it in the countries for whom it was a major issue at the time.
Thank you, Ben.
Just to follow up on that, Ian is obviously more well-versed on the European angle. For here, I mean, it's inextricably tied to the Benghazi stuff in terms of reflection. And it's almost inseparable, unfortunately, because, for many of the reasons I just cited. And among the public, obviously, it's, Benghazi is a symbol, synonymous with Watergate or something like that, a cover up or whatever. Clinton didn't call it a terrorist thing. Obama, it was part of the Romney's attacks on Obama. It was part of, obviously, the Clinton email scandal, which ironically has revealed a lot of information about what she was receiving a real time on Benghazi, which was, if you look at it objectively, was as a great resource for how the secretary is informed and asks questions and things like that. There's an interesting podcast series from the people that did Fiasco. Not perfect, obviously, but that is sort of they take it from the perspective of how a political issue becomes sort of escalates into or a foreign policy issue escalates into a series of misinformation and political controversy and things like that. It's worth listening to. But more substantively, where does the U.S. go from here? I think that was the gist of your initial question. Look, I've always been an advocate of greater U.S. participation in post-conflict Libya. I think what we've seen is when there's a lack of U.S. participation and there's a gap in how the international community responds, and even internal rivalries within Europe. France has a different take and puts its money where its mouth is in a different way than Italy or the UK or Germany, and they've all gathered international groups and high level, including leader level summits to put on a new Libyan initiative. They've never really produced anything. We don't have to go into the politics of leader negotiations and which entity is negotiating with who, the GNU versus the now Bashaga or Haftar or whatever. We can go on at length, and I've written on this before. But without the US, there's no chance that these efforts are going to play productively, because the other outside interveners who have little respect for the international community play a much deeper role in the inside, or what's going on internally in Libya. Egypt, Turkey now, the UAE and Qatar, which is amazing that they worked together in 2011, although there was fragmentations about who was working with who and who was supporting which groups. But if you look at the international community or the Gulf dynamics since, they were much closer in 2011 than obviously they are today. So the Europeans are divided. The region is divided. Russia is participating, obviously, on the ground much more dangerously. And as long as we throw up our hands at the situation or put minimal effort into it, all due respect to the people who are working the issue hard, but it requires leadership commitment and a commitment from the top of the administration to have uncomfortable conversations with folks in the region that they want other things from. In other words, we can work on Israeli-Palestinian issues and on Libya at the same time, or Iran and Libya at the same time, as opposed to just Iran or Israel-Palestine. Then it's not going to be feasible to change their attitudes. And we can talk more or offline or whatever on specifics, but that and the Russian issue is serious, and if that doesn't get resolved and is not a motivation for the U.S., I don't know what will. And the final thing I wrote about in the summer, when Libyan oil production went almost to zero because of the blockade by Haftar. Again, if that didn't motivate the U.S. in a time of oil shortages globally, I don't really know what will.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I have a final question that I think would be the perfect question to close on. It's related to something that I was going to ask you about, Ian. Although you make it very clear in your introduction, you say, there are no obvious lessons for future responses to crisis. The Libya experience essentially providing no obvious lessons for future responses to crisis elsewhere. But so there's a question here that relates to that a little bit from Hamza El-Kasik. The question, it says, the book gives great insights into the critical period between 2011 and 2012. My question is most concerned with post-war planning. When will the United Nations, say that quota system implemented in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Libya won't achieve long-standing peace?
The quota system.
And then related to that, there's another question that I think might be a little clarify things a bit more is, do you think the Libyan intervention brought the end of R2P?
Pretty much, yes. I don't deal a lot with R2P in the book. There are whole books, one very good one, many articles written about R2P in Libya. But I don't myself think that R2P played a major role in the decisions around the intervention, because I think policymakers who had experience of what had happened in Rwanda and Bosnia were influenced by that almost irrespective of the fact that in the meantime, the doctrine of R2P had been adopted by the General Assembly. I don't think they said, we must intervene because we've adopted the responsibility to protect. I think they were confronted with the urgency of what they thought would be a humanitarian human rights tragedy. They were very much influenced by, and that's very clear from their writings by the experience of Rwanda and Bosnia. But in terms of the future, I think there's no doubt that it's now inconceivable that the United Nations Security Council would authorize a similar intervention. It already influenced the Syria debate, as we know. I'm not sure there would have been intervention in Syria anyway for other reasons, and some of the geopolitical differences of the Syria context from Libya. But one simply can't deny that there would never have been 9 votes in the UN Security Council, let alone the withholding of vetoes by Russia and China, if they had actually known the manner in which the mandate to use force supposedly to protect civilians was going to be applied in practice. And so it's very hard to disagree with the view that in any future case, there would have to be not just a kind of open-ended all necessary measures to end with my title, with no specifying by whom they would be exerted, with what limits, with what scrutiny. That's not going to happen again, I think.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to leave it there. That's all the time that we have for our conversation today. Let me just thank you both very much, Ian Martin and Ben Fishman. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again to our audience. Be sure to get a copy of the book and read it. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and get the book.
Get the book, yes.